Some horror movies are pure fiction, but some are built on something much darker. Real cases, real victims, real crimes that investigators could never fully close. Today we are going inside 5 escalating levels of that horror, starting with the killers the police could never catch, moving through the supernatural events science could never explain, into the hauntings that were never resolved, the survival nightmares ripped from documented attacks, and finally the psychological true crime cases so brutal they changed how we understand evil. Every film on this list traces back to a real cold case file, events that remain unsettled, unsolved, or officially unexplained. These are not ghost stories. These are records, 10 films, 5 levels, and every single one of them started with something that actually happened. Level 1, the inspired slasher. Zodiac. David Fincher's Zodiac, released in 2007, opens on the 4th of July, 1969, when a masked gunman ambushes a young couple at a lover's lane in Vallejo, California, shooting both and then calling the police himself to claim responsibility. He signs his name simply Zodiac. Within weeks, coded letters begin arriving at the San Francisco Chronicle, each containing encrypted ciphers and taunting demands for publication, with the killer threatening further murders if ignored. The letters land on the desk of crime reporter Paul Avery, played by Robert Downey Jr., and draw in Robert Graysmith, a quiet Chronicle cartoonist, played by Jake Gyllenhaal, whose talent for puzzles pulls him deeper into the case than anyone expects. SFPD inspectors Dave Toschi and Bill Armstrong, played by Mark Ruffalo and Anthony Edwards, build a mounting but frustratingly circumstantial case against their prime suspect, Arthur Lee Allen. The attacks continue, including the savage daylight stabbing of 2 victims at Lake Berryessa, where the killer arrived wearing a black hood and calmly spoke before attacking with a knife. A cab driver is shot dead in San Francisco shortly after. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the letters stop. Years pass. Toshi is demoted. Avery unravels into alcoholism and disappears from the Chronicle. Armstrong quits homicide. One by one, the men who hunted the Zodiac are consumed by the case, their careers and families fractured by an investigation that produces no arrest, no conviction, and no name. Graysmith alone refuses to stop, spending years chasing leads, writing 2 books, and building a case the law could never close. The film ends with a title card confirming that Arthur Lee Allen died in 1992, and that the Zodiac killer was never officially identified. Zodiac is not just a horror film, it is a direct adaptation of actual SFPD case files, and the cold case it is built on remains open to this day. The Town That Dreaded Sundown. Alfonso Gomez-Rejon's The Town That Dreaded Sundown, released in 2014, opens on Halloween night in present-day Texarkana, where the town's annual tradition plays out at a local drive-in, a screening of the 1976 film of the same name, itself based on the real unsolved Texarkana moonlight murders of 1946. 17-year-old Jamie, played by Addison Timlin, leaves the screening early with her date Corey. A figure in a burlap sack mask emerges from the darkness, forces Corey to the ground, and slashes him to death while Jamie watches. Before releasing her, the Phantom leans close and says, "This is for Mary. Make them remember." Jamie survives and reports the attack, but the killings do not stop. A couple is murdered at a motel. 2 band members are attacked, one killed with a trombone strapped with a knife blade. Deputy Tillman and his date are slaughtered on Christmas Eve. Texas Ranger Lone Wolf Morales, played by Anthony Anderson, leads the investigation while Jamie begins her own parallel search, teaming with a young archive worker named Nick and eventually tracking down Charles Pierce Jr., son of the original film's director. Pierce Jr. reveals that a 6th victim of the 1946 murders, a man named Hank McCready, was never included in the original film or police record, erased from the cold case entirely. The new Phantom, it emerges, is Deputy Foster, McCready's grandson, killing to force the town to finally acknowledge his ancestor. Jamie shoots Foster, but his body is never recovered. The film closes with the Phantom's shadow still trailing her down a corridor. Built directly on the bones of America's most notorious unsolved serial murder case, The Town That Dreaded Sundown is a horror film haunted by a real cold case file the Phantom killer left open in 1946 and never closed. Level 2, The Supernatural Connection. The Mothman Prophecies. Mark Pellington's The Mothman Prophecies, released in 2002, opens with Washington Post columnist John Klein and his wife Mary driving at night when Mary swerves to avoid a dark winged shape in the road. The car crashes, John is unharmed, but Mary is hospitalized and dies shortly after from a brain tumor. While clearing her belongings, John finds sketches she made after the accident, repeated drawings of a massive winged creature with glowing red eyes she had never described to him. 2 years later, John inexplicably finds himself in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, 400 miles from where he was driving, with no memory of the journey. Local Sheriff Connie Mills, played by Laura Linney, has been fielding reports from residents of the same creature, a towering, red-eyed, moth-like figure, along with phantom telephone calls, hallucinations, and whispered warnings of disaster. A local man named Gordon Smallwood claims to be receiving transmissions from an entity calling itself Indrid Cold, relaying prophecies that begin to come true. John consults a paranormal researcher named Alexander Leake, who warns him that the Mothman appears before catastrophes and that those who pursue it do not survive the obsession. Gordon is later found dead from exposure. John receives a whispered warning of a great tragedy on the Ohio River and races to warn authorities of a governor's visit to a nearby chemical plant, certain that is the target. On Christmas Eve, the Silver Bridge collapses without warning, plunging dozens of vehicles into the frozen Ohio River. Connie's car goes in. John pulls her out. The film closes with text stating the creature was never seen again in Point Pleasant, mirroring the real Mothman sightings documented between November 1966 and December 1967, a paranormal cold case that no investigation has ever officially explained. Deliver Us from Evil. Scott Derrickson's Deliver Us from Evil, released in 2014, opens in Iraq in 2010, where a squad of Marines investigate a cave during combat operations and encounter something inside that the film never fully identifies. 3 years later, NYPD Special Operations Sergeant Ralph Sarchi, played by Eric Bana and based on the real retired Bronx sergeant of the same name, is working the 46th precinct with his partner Butler when a wave of violent, inexplicable crimes begins flooding the South Bronx. A former Marine named Jimmy brutally beats his wife. At the Bronx Zoo, a woman named Jane Crenna throws her toddler into the lion enclosure before crawling into the lemur pen and scraping at the ground while reciting lyrics in a trance. In the lion enclosure, Sarchi spots a painter, the same man appearing across multiple crime scenes, who flees before he can be questioned. A decomposing body is found in a basement covered in strange Latin inscriptions. Sarchi is approached by Father Mendoza, an unorthodox Jesuit priest played by Edgar Ramirez, who tells him the Marines from that Iraq cave brought something back with them, a demonic presence spreading through everyone they encountered. Sarchi, a lapsed Catholic, resists the explanation until the presence enters his own home, and his daughter begins describing a figure in the hallway. The possessed Marine, Santino, abducts Sarchi's wife and daughter, forcing Sarchi and Mendoza into a full exorcism inside the precinct. The demon is named and expelled. The family is recovered. The film closes with a title card identifying its foundation, the sealed case files of real NYPD, Sergeant Ralph Sarchi, a demonologist whose documented investigations represent supernatural crimes that conventional law enforcement could never explain, solve, or close. Level 3. The Cold Case Hauntings. The Haunting in Connecticut. Peter Cornwell's The Haunting in Connecticut, released in 2009, opens in 1987 with Sarah Campbell, played by Virginia Madsen, driving her teenage son Matt home from experimental cancer treatment at a Connecticut hospital. The commute is brutal, and the family is financially stretched, so Sarah secretly rents a large Victorian house close to the clinic without telling her husband Peter the full truth, that the property was once the Hallahan funeral home. Matt chooses the basement as his bedroom, and almost immediately begins experiencing visions of an old bearded man carving symbols into the flesh of corpses. When Peter investigates a locked door in the basement, the family discovers the original embalming room still intact, tools and all. Symbols begin appearing carved into Matt's flesh while he sleeps. His hospital friend, Reverend Popescu, played by Elias Koteas, recognizes the markings as connected to a former owner named Ramsey Aikman, who used a young clairvoyant medium named Jonah to conduct seances in the house, binding spirits to the property. The seances ended when all participants died, under circumstances the film presents as mysterious. The hauntings escalate, furniture stacks itself, children encounter burned figures in hidden spaces, and human remains are discovered concealed inside the walls. Matt becomes so consumed by Jonah's presence that Aikman's symbols are carved across his skin while he sleeps. The house eventually catches fire, and Matt is pulled out barely alive. His cancer disappears entirely after the blaze, and the film closes with text stating no further supernatural incidents were reported at the property. The film is based on the alleged experiences of the real Snedeker family, who in 1986 moved into the former Hallahan Funeral Home in Southington, Connecticut, a case investigated by Ed and Lorraine Warren that was never officially explained or closed. The Quiet Ones. John Pogue's The Quiet Ones, released in 2014, opens at Oxford University in 1974, where Professor Joseph Coupland, played by Jared Harris, is running an experiment built on a single conviction that supernatural phenomena are not real, but are instead manifestations of negative human psychic energy that can be scientifically isolated and destroyed. He recruits student cameraman Brian McNeil, played by Sam Claflin, to document the process, and sets up his experiment around a deeply troubled young woman named Jane Harper, played by Olivia Cook, who has been abandoned and generates unexplained physical phenomena. Jane believes a presence called Evie inhabits her, a doll-like entity only she can see. Coupland's method is deliberate psychological extremity, sleep deprivation, provocation, isolation, and repeated injection to force Jane to externalize her negative energy into a physical doll so it can be permanently destroyed. When the university board cuts Coupland's funding over the disturbances, he relocates the entire group to an isolated country house to continue the experiment off the grid. Strange events accelerate, objects move, apparitions attack the researchers. Jane begins carving symbols into her own skin. Brian, increasingly horrified by the methods being used, investigates independently and discovers the country house was previously used by a devil-worshipping sect called the Lilitu, and that Jane's past is directly connected to the property. Coupland refuses to stop. In the final confrontation, Jane combusts and the house burns. Harry, Chrissy, and Coupland all die. The film jumps to 2014, where an older Brian sits strapped to a chair in a psychiatric facility, insisting Evie killed everyone, as smoke begins rising from his own hands. Loosely built on the real 1972 Philip experiment, a documented scientific study to manufacture a ghost that produced results no researcher ever fully explained, The Quiet Ones is horror rooted in a genuine cold case of the human mind. Level 4, The Brutal Survival. Wolf Creek. Greg McLean's Wolf Creek, released in 2005, opens in Broome, Western Australia in 1999, where Australian Ben Mitchell and his two British friends, Liz Hunter and Christy Earle, buy a cheap station wagon to drive across the outback. The three stop at Wolf Creek Crater, hike to its center, and return to find their car will not start and their watches have all stopped at the same moment. As night falls, a large truck arrives, and a jovial bushman named Mick Taylor, played by John Jarrett, offers to tow them to his camp at the remote Navathalam Mining Company and fix the car. He gives them water around the campfire, and the three lose consciousness. Liz wakes the next day tied inside a shed. She breaks free and discovers Mick torturing Christy in a nearby garage. Liz sets their dismantled car on fire as a distraction, helps Christy escape, and shoots Mick in the neck with his own rifle. The two women flee in a recovered vehicle, but Mick, still alive, pursues them across the outback. He stabs Liz through the car seat, then severs her spine as she tries to crawl away. Christy reaches a road and flags down a passing motorist. Mick shoots the driver dead from a distance with a sniper rifle before catching and killing Christy. Her body is placed in a car boot with another corpse and set on fire. Ben eventually frees himself from captivity and is found by two passing travelers. The film closes with title cards stating that Liz and Christy's bodies were never found despite multiple major police searches. Investigations were hampered by a lack of physical evidence, and Ben was held for 4 months before being cleared. The final image is Mick Taylor's silhouette walking into the outback, directly mirroring the real Backpacker Murders cold case in which Ivan Milat's suspected accomplices were never identified and the full scope of his crimes was never closed. Backcountry. Adam McDonald's Backcountry, released in 2014, opens with Alex, played by Jeff Roop, picking up his girlfriend Jen, played by Missy Peregrym, for a weekend camping trip into a provincial nature reserve in Ontario, Canada. Alex is determined to show Jen a remote lake he remembers from his younger years and refuses a map from the park ranger, insisting he knows the trail. He has also quietly removed Jen's phone from her bag before leaving and locked it in the car. On their first night deep in the woods, a rugged Irish tour guide named Brad appears at their camp, shares dinner uninvited, openly flirts with Jen, and creates a lingering tension before disappearing. The next morning, Alex takes them off the marked trail in search of his lake, and the couple becomes hopelessly lost. They discover bear paw prints in the mud and a half-eaten deer carcass nearby. That night, the bear circles their tent, consuming their food supply. By morning, it returns. It drives a claw through the tent wall, injuring Jen before she briefly drives it off with bear spray. When it returns moments later, it drags Alex from the tent and mauls him to death while Jen watches, unable to intervene. Jen flees with nothing but Alex's engagement ring. Stalked through the forest, she attempts to climb down a waterfall to escape, slips, and breaks her ankle. She fashions a splint, drags herself forward for hours, reaches the canoe they paddled in on, and paddles back to the park entrance where she collapses in the parking lot. The film is based on the verified 2005 bear attack on Mark Jordan and Jacqueline Perry at Mississauga Lake Provincial Park in Ontario, a real predatory black bear assault that killed Perry and left investigators and wildlife experts struggling to explain the animal's sustained, targeted behavior. Level 5. The Psychological Nightmares. The Girl Next Door. Gregory M. Wilson's The Girl Next Door, released in 2007, opens in present-day New York City, where a middle-aged stock trader named David Moran, played by William Atherton, saves a homeless man's life on the street and returns home to stare at a child's drawing. The film then flashes back to the summer of 1958 in a quiet suburban New Jersey neighborhood where teenage David watches two recently orphaned sisters move in next door, 16-year-old Meg Laughlin, played by Blythe Offarth, and her younger sister Susan, who is partially disabled. They have been placed in the care of their aunt Ruth Chandler, played by Blanche Baker, a divorcee who cultivates popularity with neighborhood children by letting them drink beer and speak freely in her home. David develops feelings for Meg, but quickly notices that Ruth treats her with contempt rather than care. Ruth's attitude toward Meg shifts from cold discipline into deliberate cruelty, and she begins encouraging her sons and the neighborhood boys to participate. Meg is restrained in the basement. The abuse escalates in severity over weeks, with Ruth directing and sanctioning each escalation while the children watch and sometimes participate. David witnesses events that paralyze him with fear and guilt, and he does not act in time. Meg dies from her injuries. The film returns to the present day, where David carries the weight of his inaction across his entire adult life, his relationships destroyed by recurring guilt over what he saw and failed to stop. The film is dedicated to the real Sylvia Likens, who was tortured and murdered in Indianapolis in 1965, a case that exposed how an entire neighborhood knew, failed to intervene, and left a 16-year-old girl to die inside what looked, from the outside, like an ordinary house on an ordinary street. Borderland. Zev Berman's Borderland, released in 2007, opens in Mexico City, where Detective Ulysses and his partner raid an abandoned house and find occult sigils, animal remains, and evidence of human sacrifice. Cult members ambush them, force Ulysses to watch his partner's eyes cut out and his head severed, then shoot Ulysses in the leg and leave him alive as a warning to law enforcement to stay away. 1 year later, 3 Texas college graduates, Ed, Henry, and Phil, cross the border into Mexico for a final week of drinking before going their separate ways. After a night of mushrooms and a carnival, Phil wanders away from the group and is abducted by the same cult. He is taken to a remote desert ranch operated by the charismatic cult leader Santillan, played by Beto Cuevas, who practices Palo Mayombe, a ritualistic belief system the cult has perverted into human sacrifice, using a Ganga cauldron filled with mutilated human remains, which they believe renders their drug shipments invisible to border authorities. Phil is told he was chosen specifically because he is American and because his suffering will add greater power to the sacrifice. Ed and Henry report Phil missing, but local police refuse to act. Ulysses resurfaces and joins Ed and bartender Valeria to raid the ranch. They arrive too late. Phil has been ritually murdered. Ulysses kills Santillan but dies from his wounds shortly after. Ed and Valeria fight their way out and swim across the Rio Grande, where authorities apprehend them. The film closes with title cards stating over 50 bodies were exhumed at the ranch alongside human hair, and several cult members remain at large. Borderland is built directly on the verified 1989 murders of the Adolfo Constanzo narco-Satanist cult, a cold case whose full body count was never confirmed and whose remaining suspects were never caught. And that is the list. If you are choosing where to start, Zodiac is the one if you want to feel what it is like to chase a killer who was smarter than everyone hunting him. Wolf Creek will get under your skin if you have ever driven somewhere remote and wondered what would happen if the wrong person stopped to help. And if you are ready for the one that makes you question how evil can live right next door behind a normal front door on a normal street, the girl next door is waiting. Drop a comment telling me which cold case connection disturbed you the most. Hit like and subscribe. More real horror breakdowns coming soon.